Hey everyone, TJ All's I-45 Now in Galveston Now. Welcome back to another edition of Healthcare Unmasked presented by UTMB Health. Interesting subject we have here today, and you have to kind of follow along because we're talking about some research and how to prevent premature births. Now, it's a tough way of figuring out how to do prevention, particularly if you're using drugs and the like, and trying to find how those drugs would help, because the subject matters, well, they're pregnant women. And at that same time, you don't want to be poking and prodding around. And to discuss that with us, it's great to have on the head of that research, Dr. R. Menon, with us here today. And Dr. Menon, let me just ask, because we have been calling this pregnancy on a chip. So first, kind of explain what that concept is, because folks are going to see that what we've been promoting here as pregnancy on a chip, and they'll say, what are you talking about with that? So in kind of a short way, kind of explain what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so what you said about pregnancy on a chip is what you're seeing here. But there's a lot to go before how we got to this pregnancy on a chip. Because TJ, you started off saying premature birth. So we have to think about what causes premature birth. I mean, as you know, that premature birth is complicating about 15 million pregnancies around the globe per year, and it leads to about 1 million deaths, neonatal deaths. So those million babies that are born prematurely will not see their first birthday because of complications of prematurity. So my research has been focused on what causes these premature birth. What type of risk the mother can get exposed to that can cause premature birth? What are the mechanisms that lead to premature birth? These mechanistic understanding is what my research focus at UTMB, OBGYN, Basic Science and Translational Research Lab is all about. And I've been doing this for the last 33 years, and in UTMB it's almost 12 years now.
And as I started off in saying in the show, is this is a difficult part of the research side of things, because your subjects that are your patients that you're trying to help with in your research. I mean, most times when you want to test out, say, will this drug work or the like, folks will come in for clinical trials and volunteer for that. Not too many mothers would be doing this because they're making a decision when they're trying to give birth. And so this is an innovative way you've been able to come about taking a look at this research. How did this dawn on you to take this approach, which basically, and I'm glad you and I had a really good pre-conversation on this, because essentially when you're doing these trials, what you're really testing is how the body will react to something, but it's really how the tissues of each organ reacts to things.
Precisely.
And so essentially that's what you've done with the pregnancy on the chip, is the tissues from each of what would of a woman's body for pregnancy is what's on that chip, correct?
Right. So pregnancy, as you said, it is very difficult to study, because who is the patient here? Pregnancy has two individuals in one body, the mother and her fetus. So they are coexisting for almost 10 months, and one day the baby will be delivered. And prematurely, if it happens, it's called preterm birth, right? So if the mother is sick, or if preterm labor happens, that is prematurely the labor happens at 30 weeks or 25 weeks or earlier than that, or later than 30 weeks, before 37 weeks, it's called preterm labor. Now, who is the patient, the mother or the baby or the fetus? How will we treat them? We have to identify the patient first. It may be both of them are equally contributing to preterm labor. So our study started using a single organ. Let's say you can start with the uterus, which is the maternal tissue. The mother carries the uterus. Or you can study the placenta, which is a fetal tissue, or placental membranes or fetal membranes, which is a fetal tissue. So all of these individual tissues, or cervix, which is a maternal tissue, all of them can contribute to preterm labor. And many labs around the world studies individual organs at a time. Some study placenta. My lab studies fetal membranes. Some lab study cervix. Some lab study uterus. And there are mechanisms that we can identify that can lead to preterm birth associated with each of these organs.
Right.
So our drugs are designed based on what we get from a single organ-based studies. We have done that for a very long time. But what we learn from that is that knowledge is not enough to stop preterm birth or design a drug. And that's why we still have very high rate of preterm birth around the world.
And let's talk about those rates, because when you brought this up to me before we sat down to do this show, I was shocked. Give us the rates of premature birth rates.
So globally, it's about 15 million preterm birth happens around the world. If it comes to the United States, almost 600,000. We have about 3 to 3.5 million pregnancies, and of that, about 600,000 or slightly more now as premature birth. And if you look at the rate, it has not changed in the last several decades.
Right.
It's actually going up, which also leads to maternal mortalities, neonatal mortalities, and morbidities. So the rate is either staying as it is for the last several decades or slightly going up. We are not able to control the rate or reduce the rate. So it's a prime important for healthcare industry to address this issue and understand what causes and how we can reduce the rate. We may not be able to completely prevent, but we should be able to reduce the rate if we can understand what causes, what leads to preterm birth, and design the drugs to treat them and test them too.
And it's one of those things too, is that in the medical world, there's been advances in almost every segment of whether it's cancer, whether it's dealing with orthopedics issues, cardiac issues, nephrology with kidney, liver issues, all of these things that affect us on our daily lives. There's been some type of advances in decades, but what you're seeing with the rate of premature births, there's not really been a medical advancement that can make an adjustment there.
Right. So we have made medical advancement. We can, if you look at the United States, we can save premature babies at a very high rate compared to some of the other parts of the world. So where they do not have advanced medical care. The neonatal intensive care units saves a lot of babies in the United States because we do have a very well advanced medical care in the NICUs. But we're not making advances in the obstetrics or perinatal obstetrics world. So that's where we need to make major changes, and it starts with fundamental basic science research. So we haven't made a great progress in that area, in the basic science area of obstetrics research or perinatal research. That's what we try to do.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, folks, and stick around with us on this, because when we come back after this word from UTMB Health, we're going to really kind of dive down into your research here and bring it to a level for folks to understand. And so I encourage you, anyone who's thinking about having a baby, knows someone who's thinking about having a baby, in a family that may have a history of premature births as well. This will be a subject I think you're going to be interested in hearing and what the research is going along, and we'll do that when we come back right after these words from UTMB Health.
There's nothing more important than quality health care for you and your family. That's why UTMB Health is in the communities where you live, providing easy access to innovative care. At UTMB, we know our patients need personalized care to lead healthy and fulfilling lives, providing everything from primary care and specialty care to urgent care and emergency medicine. UTMB knows healthcare. UTMB knows you. To find a UTMB doctor near you, visit utmbhealth.com.
And welcome back with Dr. Menon here again to talk about pregnancy on a chip, but it's more than that simple phrase. It's essentially all the work that's being done with research to find out how to lessen the number of premature births that happen not only in our area or in our country, but internationally as well. And you and I, when we first got talking about this, I was asking, and you showed off one of the chips there. And when I look at it, it looks like just kind of a large slide like we used to have in biology class. And what you have here is one, but there have been so many developed as part of this research. Tell us about that and why you've had to do so many.
Yeah, so when we started doing research, it was like you take placenta, for example, or placental fetal membranes. These are some of the fetal tissues that actually protects the fetus during pregnancy. So you take some of these tissues after their delivery or after childbirth, and you dissect them and grow them in the lab as single cells and study them. They're what we call 2D cultures. So many labs around the world do that, these 2D culture study, and we have learned a lot from these studies over several decades. Now, then you can start putting it together as an organ. So these tissue cells contribute to an organ, like say placenta contains several cell types. So several labs study tissue types. Now, what we learn from all these studies is studying them in silos is not contributing to the full knowledge of how pregnancy happens. As I said, there are two individuals here. They're constantly interacting to each other. If the mother eats something, fetus can respond to that, what she is eating, or if she is breathing something, the fetus also gets that. So if you don't study them together as a single unit, it's difficult to understand pregnancy as a whole concept. So that's where we started developing these organs on a chip. It varies recreating the entire organ. So, for example, placenta on a chip means recreating the placenta with all the cell types. They're all interconnected so that you can maintain that interaction that you expect that is inside the body. Now, so we studied placenta, we studied cervix, we studied uterus, we studied fetal membranes, but they're all in individual silos, individual compartments.
Right.
It's still not representing the entire pregnancy. So what we decided to do eventually in my lab, my colleagues, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Kamala, all of them, specifically Dr. Lauren Richardson, who is instrumental in developing these chips, we came up with the concept that we cannot do them in silos. We have to put the entire pregnancy organs together where they can interact each other and they can recreate that whole pregnancy environment on a chip. As you can see, this is probably as the size of a flash drive that you have, maybe even lesser, smaller than a flash drive. So what you are seeing here is the entire pregnancy, starting with the lower uterine segment, the vagina cervix, and then moving up to the upper uterine segment. Then you have the placenta, you have the fetal membrane, you have some of the fetal compartments here. So the entire pregnancy is represented on this chip. They're all interconnected, just like the way that you see the interconnections during pregnancy in a human body.
Right. In one of the ways that I use this comparison in our pre-meeting is that when I look at that closely, it reminds me of when you have nodes in an electric chip. And that's why the term of chip. If you have a computer chip, you see the nodes and you see how everything is done, and there's that interconnectivity. And this side does one thing, this side does another thing, this side, and so that was the hurdle for me mentally to get over that. Yeah. That's what that's why it's us called a chip versus a slide, and the terminology matters here.
Because the mold before this chip is manufactured, made in the lab, the mold is actually created using a silicon wafer. And from there, you slowly start to build these components, compartments, microfluidic channels, and all those things. So the silicon wafers are used in the initial phase of this development of this chip, and these are used in the computer technology as well. So that's why it's called a chip.
Chip, yeah. It's like when we say silicon that's used to make a chip,
right.
And that when you explain that to me, that's when I went, now I kind of get the concept here. And we should point out, too, I think it's very important here early on to point out that where this material comes from. And, there's always the concerns of folks who have, certain beliefs that this is coming from aborted fetuses or cadavers or anything like that. You actually need you don't do that.
Right.
So explain how you
Yes.
get this material.
So these tissues are coming. So if it's a fetal membrane or the placenta, they're coming from tissues after the delivery. These are called discarded placenta or discarded fetal membranes. So we take those discarded tissues after the delivery of the fetus. It can come from normal term delivery of the fetus. And we bring that to the lab and then dissect that tissue and make individual cells. And then we convert them into cell lines so that we can repeatedly use them in the lab. So we don't have to go back to the OR or the labor and delivery room and collect placenta all the time. So we have created cell banks, these cell line banks. So we use those cell lines. So this particular chip uses 13 different cell lines that is coming from the maternal side and a bunch from the fetal side. So we are not using the aborted fetuses or cadavers, as you mentioned.
Right.
These are discarded tissue coming after the delivery of the fetus, a live fetus. So, it's a live fetus. After normal pregnancy, normal birth, we collect those placental tissue or the fetal maternal tissue and put them on the chip.
And that's an important part of this research because you need to do that from a normal birth,
Right.
not necessarily a premature birth, because what you're doing is taking the normal cells.
Correct.
To be able to say, okay, when we do this is the reaction we get.
Yes.
Particularly when we're talking about drugs and how that interactivity goes. But this research, while it sounds very advanced, is really, the pun intended here, is in its infancy as well, is it not?
Yes. So you brought up an interesting point. So what we are creating with the cells that we get are a healthy pregnancy model. First, that we create a healthy pregnancy model. Because unless you understand what a healthy pregnancy means, you really won't be able to understand what an unhealthy pregnancy or diseased pregnancy means. So we first create a healthy pregnancy with all these cells and then introduce some of the potential risk that mother can experience during pregnancy. For example, infection. It's a very common cause of or factor associated with preterm birth. So we put an infectious material here, and now we see how these infectious agent spreads throughout all these different organs. We can actually create a disease model of pregnancy by introducing an infectious agent to this chip or one of the compartments of the chip. You can select the compartment. You can select the fetal infection. You can mimic a maternal infection. So you can do multiple different ways you can create a disease model. Now, it doesn't have to be infection. If you wanted to recreate, let's say, cigarette smoking is a major factor for preterm birth, you can actually introduce cigarette smoke extract to this and recreate that environment.
So it's not just drugs to test how it reacts. You can put in the stresses.
Yes.
Nicotine, alcohol, all of that.
Yes.
Into this testing to see what's happening.
Yes.
Yes, we know that smoking while pregnant, drinking while pregnant, using illicit drugs while pregnant, that's kind of the easy, common understanding point A to point B type thing. It's kind of known.
Exactly.
That's it. Because you can, if there's a premature birth, you can test the blood and find, oh, wait, there's high nicotine here. This is probably a contributing factor. But by doing this with the chip, it gives you that advantage of knowing exactly what's going on in that case, more than just a, hey, well, if it happened here, that's probably what happened here. You're able to actually see how the tissue reacts.
Exactly. So we create the healthy pregnancy, we create a disease model of pregnancy with whatever the risk factor is, and now we know exactly what is happening and where it's happening, how that tissue is responding. The next question is, can we stop it from happening? I mean, it's like environmental pollutants.
Right.
It's almost impossible for a woman to relocate during pregnancy, right? I mean, she's going to get exposed to that environmental pollutants during her pregnancy. So what is the best way we can assess her risk and how can we potentially intervene is what that risk exposure can do to her pregnancy. Now we know, okay, placenta is impacted, cervix is impacted, or because of this. Can we provide a drug? Now we put the drug on here and see which drug can go to such and such place or such and such organ, and what type of reaction they can produce, or can they revert this back, the disease state, back to a healthy state. So we can test all these drugs preclinically using this chip. Now we're not just looking at one single cell. We're looking at the entire pregnancy. So if you give a drug to the mother, can it reach the fetal tissues?
Right, because it could
Yes.
be going in and interacting with another part
Yes.
of the body before it gets to where it's needed.
Precisely.
Right.
So, if you look at why we don't have a drug for treating preterm birth these days, part of the reason that FDA does not approve drugs because we don't know what happens on the fetal side. Is it harming the fetus? Is it benefiting the fetus? Is this causing more damage to the mother if she is taking during pregnancy? We don't know any of these things. Having the whole system in one place, we should be able to tell exactly what happens to the fetus, what happens to the mother. Is this toxic to the fetus? Can this be safe to be given during pregnancy? All those things can be potentially answered using having the whole system in one place.
When we come back, Dr. Menon and I are going to talk some more on this, but it's also going to be talking about the different approaches that this has kind of led to, and to do that. And then we'll do that when we return. This is UTMB Health's Healthcare Unmasked. We'll be back right after this.
UTMB Health knows that when you need advanced surgical care, you want a specialist who's an expert in their field. Our surgeons provide innovative and advanced treatment options for adults and children, for neurosurgery, GI, heart surgery, ENT, urology, and more. UTMB knows surgical care. UTMB knows you. To find a UTMB Health specialist near you, visit utmbhealth.com.
And welcome back to Healthcare Unmasked, presented by UTMB Health. I'm TJ Alt, I-45 Now in Galveston now, and Dr. Menon is still with us here. And again, folks, as I've said many times on this show, that the research component at UTMB Health is some of the most fascinating stuff that's happening. And as Dr. Reiser told us when our new president at UTMB Health told me on his first interview with us that that the research side means something. A lot of times, folks will look at research from afar and say, "Well, they're just researching everything else," but it really has those practical elements. We've seen it in real time with COVID, with the development of testing, development of drugs, development of vaccines, and therapies along the way here recently. But one of the things that most common when folks think about medical research is, well, they're testing on animals, chimpanzees, and the like for that. And that may have been the case here, but why is that not the route that's taken in this type of research?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, let me make a comment about the UTMB and the basic research here. If you look at UTMB, this is one of the best places where we conduct translational research. So how can we take the bedside knowledge to bedside practices? Mm-hmm. That's what UTMB research is emphasizing on. So coming to animal models, that's an interesting concern, and we do that to some extent in my lab also, animal model research. If you look at human pregnancy, obviously you are not going to get tissues and cannot collect specimens during pregnancy. It's almost impossible to collect tissues, especially normal pregnancy, right? So what are the alternate? You always go back to an animal model to study. Mm-hmm. Now the problem is we do not have a drug to treat preterm labor, and you can blame it partly on we do not have an animal model that resembles human pregnancy. The closest that you can get is non-human primate model, but they are incredibly expensive and you need large numbers. So it is almost cost prohibitive to do non-human primate model research. None of the other animal models mimic human pregnancy, so that FDA doesn't accept the data coming from. This is partly why we went back to humanizing our pregnancy models. So This pregnancy on a chip is a humanized pregnancy model because we're using human cells here. So we can do a whole bunch of preclinical trials that we use animal models for using. I mean, we can replace these pregnancy on a chip with where we earlier on or in the past we used to depend on animals. So we can minimize or reduce the numbers or minimize the use of animals if we start using chips like this, organ on chips like these that we are using. Can we eliminate animal models completely? Not necessarily, because we still have to do some level of toxicology testing as well as transgenerational effect. So if you give a drug during pregnancy, yeah, it may be safe for that particular pregnancy to have a term delivery, ending up term delivery, but what happens to that mother in the future after taking that drug? Or what happens to that baby that is born exposed to that drug? Is it going to have some kind of impact during the course of life? So that type of questions can only be answered only using animal models. However, a whole bunch of preclinical trials that we are depending on animal models now can be replaced with a chip like this, a pregnancy on a chip like this. So we can definitely minimize some of the data that are not at all useful that are coming from animal models can also be eliminated using chips like this.
And it also kind of goes to the essential thing is that there's only so much, as you kind of noted, is there's only so much you can do with an animal model, animal research with it, that, you know, because really what you're designing here is for human use, and it's always best to have that be the subject there. But obviously this is really and this is something we've talked about a lot in the medical field, is there's so much that can't be done on pregnancies overall. We talked about this during COVID. It's like, you know, who in her right mind is going to take a shot while pregnant? And that's totally understandable.
Right.
And the medical world understands that. So that's why there's a limited understanding of what to do with pregnant women. Right now, there is a standard, but that really is more guesswork than it is actual science, because we just don't know. Right. Do you see that? I know, this is early on in all, and obviously when you're early on in something, like you said, the infancy of something, you are, the world's your oyster. It's open at this point. But do you see this as a possibility of this can also help identify someone who's more a potential mother who's more at risk of a premature birth because of certain conditions or certain medical background? Do you see this research as being help in that area as well?
Yes, we can recreate. So thanks for bringing up the COVID issue. COVID vaccine, a lot of clinical dilemma is on the patient side as well as on the physician side. Is it safe to give this vaccine during pregnancy? How is that going to impact the baby that is growing? The mother may benefit, but is the baby going to react to it and he's going to have a beneficial effect or a harmful effect? We don't have the answer. And that kind of dilemmas can be eliminated by testing those vaccines on this chip, because you have the entire pregnancy here. You can see, is the vaccine going to go towards the fetus? Is it going to cross the placental barriers so that it can reach the fetus? Is it going to benefit the fetus? Is it going to harm the fetus? All these you can have an answer before we even introduce this to the field. So yes, absolutely. This can new drugs that are developed. I mean, for example, drugs that we commonly approved and we use for, let's say, Tylenol, aspirin.
Right.
Some of these drugs are not recommended during pregnancy because we don't know how it is going to harm. So we can actually do repurposing of drugs. That is, FDA has already approved these drugs for some conditions. Can we use that during pregnancy? Yes, we can test that here now. We can have an answer, yes or no.
So in a way, too, this is a way to kind of go back, not just looking at it from pregnancy and premature births, but also as what can you do for common things to come across. I mean, you bring up, ibuprofen. By the way, I should point out you have a lot in your system today because you had a root canal, as you shared with me, and I feel so bad for you going through this. But ibuprofen, it is that you can, because the recommendations are, if you do use it, very limited.
Right.
Of, all right, we can test and see what effect does that have on the fetus if you're pregnant at the time. And I would think too, it would also make a difference in understanding at what point of the pregnancy, are you in the first trimester, the second, or toward the end, right? I mean, that comes into play too with that, because as we have the ever changing, as the baby is growing, the fetus is becoming a baby, that along those stages that, you can test for a lot of things that, because as you said right off the bat, what the mother intakes, the baby is intaking. At the same time, what the mother's stress is, the baby's doing. So you can be able to look at what is already common factors and not just about premature births.
Absolutely. I mean, so it's not just for premature birth only. I mean, any pregnancy complication, normal pregnancy. I mean, even if you're, we clearly have to have an understanding of normal pregnancy. Then only we can understand complicated pregnancy or adverse pregnancy outcome events. So it is not just for premature birth. Pre-eclampsia, hypertension during pregnancy, some other conditions during pregnancy. All this can be recreated on the chip. It just need to design it in a way that we are recreating that environment, that condition in the lab on a chip during the different cells. So it is the way we design the research experiments, the such approaches, asking questions. We can potentially use this not only for preterm birth, but many other purposes.
It has the potential here that's so great. But it takes money to do this. What type of financial support, where are you getting this funding from right now?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, so if you one of the reasons that I see that why this field is not advancing, like many other fields, as you mentioned, cardiovascular risk, kidney risk, cancer risk, is for funding, plenty of funding. See, our research, so we're primarily depending on NIH funding, National Institute of Health funding. NICHT is one of the major funding agencies. They fund a lot of prematurity research, but the amount of funding is limited when it comes to pregnancy, women's health, child health. Compared to many other institutes in the NIH, this is probably one of the most underfunded area of research.
I find that fascinating, and not in a good way. We're talking about babies as a commerce or a multi-billion-dollar business. I would think Gerber. I would think anyone makes a child seat. I mean, all of that, diapers, people in those fields would want to say, hey, we want to give some money to this too, to make sure that funding's there, so we have healthy babies that we're selling to the moms the products that do. I just, and obviously the first that comes to mind is, you're talking about NIH funding, first comes to mind is the March of Dimes, who forever has been focused on this subject. But a lot of that effort, I think, has changed over the years, more of dealing on legislative efforts and the like. Is that be not knocking on the March Dimes? I mean, it's just the priority's not on the research side as much as it used to be.
So they do fund. Still, March Dimes have still a limited amount of funding. They do fund some centers. Burroughs Wellcome Foundation is another funding agency. Gates Foundation has funded prematurity research, but it's still nothing like that you see in the other areas of medicine and health. So we do need more philanthropic support to conduct this, so that awareness that prematurity is a major complication. The numbers that we see is really alarming, and it is not changing for decades. I mean, as I said, I've been in the field for 3 decades. I don't see a dent in that there is no drop in the rate. So we do need to create an awareness that pregnancy is an area that we need to address to have healthy babies, not just to save babies, but also to have healthy babies born. So by preventing or reducing the rate of preterm birth, we can have more healthy babies. So if you look at the tagline for my lab, it's the Menon Lab. It's about saving babies. So our goal is not just to save, but also have healthy and happy babies.
Yeah, I mean that's because the real basics of this also is the fact that if a baby is born prematurely, the cost of care at the start is exorbitant. Often, though, what's missed is down the line that there are a good percentage of premature babies who have problems with health down the line, and let's face it here, that while premature births are effective in demographics across the board, that really it comes into a socioeconomic as well as a racial component here because of access to healthcare. We talk about that a lot on this show. Elsewhere, the access to healthcare within minority communities, access to healthcare for those in a lower end of the socioeconomic factors in our country, that those carry on for generations. It's not just the upfront cost of had a premature, it's in NICU for a while. It is the after going home and the health conditions that exist after that.
Absolutely. So, one of the goals that we have with developing these pregnancy on a chip is to address that disparity, health disparity that we see. Racial disparity is a major issue in prematurity, because if you look at African American race versus Caucasian race, so Caucasian is about 11% and African Americans is almost 16 to 17%. So there's a huge disparity. Regardless of socioeconomic status, especially in the southern part of the United States, we see a large number of complications of pregnancy. And you pointed out that the adult onset diseases that we see in children early on, during their developmental stages, is partly linked to premature birth, because they came out early, their systems are not mature, they are much more prone to have adult onset diseases like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, childhood diabetes, asthma, some form of cancers. All these can be linked to preterm birth. So can we address that? Yes, we can, because we can actually recreate personalized chips, based on of an individual or based on the sex of the fetus, because we see the differences in male fetuses versus female fetuses. So my lab is now engaged in generating cell lines, say for example, from African American male fetuses, African American female fetuses, Caucasian male fetuses, female fetuses, so that we can put them and individually test them to see what the difference between this versus that. So we can actually use these kind of chips to personalize, and eventually we can treat preterm birth on a personalized basis. That's the whole healthcare industry is moving in that direction, personalized medicine.
Yeah.
How can we implement that in pregnancy and during premature preterm labor conditions? We should be able to do it in the future.
And that individualized medicine, may sound isolated, actually isn't when you consider to get to that point. As you have said, Dr. Reiser has said, I think every guest we've ever had on this show has said, get rid of the silos. Which to me is one of those things. We used to call it territorial fights, in the deal. But it is the one thing I think that finally we're seeing in the medical field across the board is we have been approaching this not as a holistic thing, but as essentially a one thing over here, one thing over here, one over here. I always liken it to, particularly for cancer patients in the older days, I say older days, not too distant futures, but, that MD Anderson was kind of the one that developed everybody in one spot. You're going to go see your oncologist, but guess what? Here's your primary care. Here's also your kidney specialist, because that may be it. Or here's this. And they're not just oncology you're dealing with. You're dealing with everyone who has a specialty, but they're all meeting as a team. That's what this kind of leads to as well. Individual medicine, but it starts with breaking down the silos and bringing everything together, correct?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So, this is just a first step, the pregnancy on a chip. Putting it all together, studying the mother and the fetus together in a humanized way, not just on an animal or just in silos. That is one of the first steps that we do now. And I think that this, in the future, we can bring several components. We can make advancements to this chip too. I mean, this is, I would say, it's in very early stages of research. As funding comes through, we should be able to advance this research in multiple different lines that, as you mentioned, how can we do individualized research, personalized treatment? That's the goal. I mean, so, and I think UTMB is helping us to establish this line of research, and I'm very thankful for that.
But it always comes down to the money.
Yes, funding is critical because my lab is currently supported by multiple NIH grants. The National Center for Advanced Translational Science, NCADS, has funded multiple projects in my lab, especially to develop these type of chips. And they're also asking us to develop new drugs, test them using these chips, and see whether we can propose that to FDA. So preclinical trials are now ongoing in my lab using some of these chips. And eventually we are hoping that we should be able to bypass many of the hurdles that we face, such as animal model data, and we can actually replace that with the pregnancy on a chip data, and it will be much more appealing to the FDA for approval during pregnancy.
So if you're out there, he calls it we call it the Menon Lab. Menon Lab, but you wouldn't mind having that name changed up if someone writes a really big check to help with this, would
I
you?
would not mind at all.
I was going to say,
happy to have a big check.
Right, if you're watching this, you got a big checkbook, and do that. But again, it is, and I think we'd be doing the public a great service if we take this show and send it to every company that makes baby products anywhere, because this is their interest right here, yes. And it is, as I told you, once I got past the whole how do you do a pregnancy on the chip concept, my mind was just flooded of how this research, and I can't say it enough, folks, and we've done a lot. This has been the greatest part for me to do the show. Yes, we can talk about how to have good cardiovascular health. We're going to talk about breast cancer and cancer with women, next month, obviously, as Broad Dazzle approaches. But that the research, and, you obviously said the same thing, that happens in this institution is fascinating when you listen to this here and understand what that's going to do, not just now, but down the road as well. And it gets me to that kind of last question to you. Where do you go next now with this?
So, that's we are taking some baby steps now, understanding how a
pun fully intended, by the way. We should have
now and understanding what a healthy pregnancy look like. Is it reproducible? And then we start developing a disease pregnancy, preterm pregnancy, drug trials. That's where we are slowly advancing. Actually, we have done quite a bit already. And in the next year or so, we should be able to start doing some preclinical drug trials using those chips. And we are hoping that we can propose some new drugs, existing drugs, for FDA approvals for use during pregnancy. And if a pharmaceutical industry comes up with a new vaccine they wanted to test during pregnancy, we should be ready to test that in the lab now. New drug, somebody is making a new drug. It costs billions of dollars to get a drug to market. These kind of technology advancement can incredibly reduce the cost of preclinical trials, because we're reducing the use of animal models. We are also using a humanized approach in these research. Mm-hmm. All these things eventually will cut down the cost. Also, these are much more easier to do than waiting for an animal to get pregnant, then treating them. So we are saving a lot of time and manpower by doing this kind of chip technology.
And it's also, too, when you talk about that, is that on the cost savings, not obviously that's not the ultimate goal here, but that on the cost savings side of things, too, is when you do a clinical trial, you're bringing in hundreds, thousands of people at a time. Some are getting placebo, some are getting the real deal, some are getting a mix, those type of things. That's costly and time consuming. I would think this concept can really not only it can speed up the process as well as
Yep.
as saving them. This is just grabbing samples of tissue. I say just, but still,
Yep.
you get that, and then you move
Yep.
on from there.
Right. We still have to do clinical trials.
Right.
But what we do is we speed up the process of getting to clinical trials. What happens now is many labs, including my own lab, is developing and testing new drugs. But the problem is we're not even reaching a clinical trials phase. Many of them fail to reach because we don't have the right data to convince the
Right.
FDA.
The data is what matters.
What
you
matters.
have to have
Yeah.
that data
Yeah.
to give to the
Yeah.
FDA. Despite what some people say in the world, in this political climate we're in, the data still matters. The data still has to go through. Experts have to look at that, and the FDA's got a lot of those folks as well to look at it and say, "Hey,
Yeah.
is this really safe?" And a lot of hard questions have to be answered a lot of the way.
Right.
Dr. Menon, thanks for being on with us. This is I say, folks, I know I'm beating the dead horse here. It is fascinating to hear because the potential here. I mean, and we're not going to get into the, obviously the obvious question is that what else can these be used for? I think anyone can guess the potential right now. You're focused in this one area, this area, which is very important. Let's get the babies healthy first, right? And then we'll worry about what can be done down the line with this. But the technology opens doors to other things.
Yes.
The concept, that's the best part of research is that what you're working on here, yes, this is your goal, but the other things that can come from that. I say the same thing when we talk about mRNA. mRNA concept has been around for a while. We all know it now because of COVID, but mRNA research has been going on for a good while, and the potential that actually holds. And then when you find that practical use for it, it explodes all the way.
Exactly.
Thanks so much for that. And well, what did I say? I said, where you get the funding, we've put on the lower third just in case you got that check, folks. Of where you can do if you own a drug company and you're watching this. Hopefully you are from this. Write the check. It is a. And if you as I said, if you're a diaper manufacturer, you want to do this too. It gets you more customers. Trust me, and that works for you as well. And I'm not making light of that. I'm seriously mean this, and I appreciate you being on with us. And
thank you for having me.
It's a fascinating topic.
Pleasure.
We're going to get you on again. Yeah, it's. I love it when we can have a really good topic, have a really good conversation, and you can tell the passion you've got for this. That's for sure. And I know we've held you up. You have as we're recording this, you've got a meeting to get to. Folks, if you want to send questions in, feel free. We'll pass them on to Dr. Menon, and we'll share those with you. Reminder too, coming up in just a second here, we'll tell you about how you can get ready for Brawdazzle 2023. I'm the MC for that again too, and that's coming up right after this word from UTMB Health.
$15,000 minimum donation from Brawdazzle. That money is going to be a lot more when it's all said and done.
We're just so excited. We're very grateful. These women will benefit from this donation. There are so many that are uninsured, that are underinsured, that still need our services. There are many who are working and they don't have health insurance. Sometimes people can't get to our clinics. Sometimes there are transportation issues, childcare issues. Having a mobile mammography unit that's able to help the underserved is a very big boost for our county and our region. So we're very appreciative for the fund.
So make sure you join us for Brawdazzle. It's going to be a great event. It's always a fun event too, and looking forward. The best part of it is like folks like Jimmy Fullen, Doug Bally, the police chief in Galveston, they come out with these bras on that have been decorated. It's a great fashion show if you've ever seen one but it also raises a lot of money for a great cause, and that's that UTMB mobile mammography program that's been around. So make sure you join us for that. We have more information for you online about that as well. Join us next month for our next edition of Healthcare Unmasked. I'm TJ Alds, I-45 Now and Galveston Now.
There's nothing more important than quality health care for you and your family. That's why UTMB Health is in the communities where you live, providing easy access to innovative care. At UTMB, we know our patients need personalized care to lead healthy and fulfilling lives. providing everything from primary care and specialty care to urgent care and emergency medicine. UTMB knows healthcare. UTMB knows you. To find a UTMB doctor near you, visit utmbhealth.com.